I'm a boy, 18, and I really need guidance from someone. I was just kicked out of my own house. I have never had a flawless family to begin with. My parents waited 4 years to become parents before they became pregnant with me. People have told me that my mom's pregnancy was a miracle because they had given up on them after many years of trying. On the other hand, my parents were overjoyed to learn that my mom was expecting and immediately began making plans for the future. My grandmother has informed me that this euphoria was fleeting since my parents were never truly content with one another. They have never really stopped fighting, even when my mom became pregnant with me. They have always had a lot of ugly arguments. Every day, their arguments centered around essentially the same issues. Mom detested Dad's gambling, and Dad detested the fact that Mom drank all day long despite being pregnant with me. To give in. Mom originally agreed when Dad decided to give up gambling as long as she stopped drinking, but she never followed through. When Dad discovered that she was surreptitiously stashing alcohol bottles about the home, she would occasionally sneak a sip. By now, he discovered that her consuming alcohol was putting me in risk as well as her. Dad therefore set her a deadline. My mom did not seem to take well to his threat that he would leave her if she did not cease. According to my grandmother, my mom became quite enraged and began verbally abusing my dad as a result. After that, she hurled a pair of scissors at my dad, injuring him when it struck the corner of his eyes. Really? He was later told, upon being sent to the doctor, that he was exceedingly fortunate not to have suffered a lifelong loss of eyesight from his partial corneal laceration, which was treatable. My mom was so terrified by this that she pleaded with my dad not to bring any charges against her since she had pledged to do better. My dad made the decision to move on. I've been informed that both of my parents were overjoyed to have me and did everything in their power to raise me. That calm between them, though, was short-lived. My grandma says that one day when my dad got home from work, he found me sobbing uncontrollably in my nursery and my mom unconscious and obviously intoxicated on the sofa. She said that it was only one drink and that he would have called CPS on her. He was incensed and woke her up to confront her about it, if she hadn't soothed him. I wish he had, since Mom wisely began to limit her drinking to the morning hours after Dad left, so as to avoid being discovered. Later on in the night, I was losing weight quickly and my health began to suffer. Therefore, I must have gone hungry for a long time. My grandmother would usually find the house in a terrible mess when she came to visit. The floor would be filthy and sticky, there would be dirty dishes in the sink, and everything would be in disorder. She would come home to find me with my hair combed and me dressed in filthy diapers. And every time she attempted to discuss the state of the house or me with my mom would get very defensive and tell her to shut up. During one of my mom's visits, my grandma noticed that my mom was obviously intoxicated during the day, since she was unable to understand what my mom was saying and could not stop laughing. Mom became irate and argued that it wasn't a big problem when Grandma confronted her about it. At that point, my grandmother made the decision to give up. In order to take care of me, she spent the entire day with me. Afterwards, after my dad returned from his job, she insisted on looking after me for a few months so she could check my mom into a recovery facility. My mom attempted to fight back, but my dad, who must have seen that his wife needed assistance as well, instantly agreed with my grandma. When my mother was being admitted, for a few months I moved in with my grandmother, and those were the most amazing times of my life. She gave me baths, read aloud to me every night, prepared wholesome meals, and took me to play in the park. I had no idea that these were the kinds of things parents were expected to do for their kids. Unlike my mother, she didn't yell at me when I wanted to play with her. If I ever accidentally shattered my plate, she never gave me a spanking. I felt safe living with my grandmother. Over time, my grandmother gradually took over the role of a mother figure for me, and she has been my primary caregiver ever since. She is my grandmother, and for that I am incredibly thankful. I don't know how else I could have made it through all those years. Because he missed me so much, my dad would come see me frequently. He would tell me how much my mother missed me and how eager she was to recover so she could reunite with me. To be honest, I was a little afraid to return to my parents' house. All I want is to live with my grandmother forever. But when my mother did finally get clean and receive her AA sobriety chip a few months later, she made a point of driving over to see me at my granny's house. Seeing my mother after so many months seemed awkward, and like I was meeting someone for the first time. After my mother and grandmother had a conversation, my mother did appear much better, and I was told that I would be returning to my parents' house later this weekend. My mother told me that she was my parent and that I had no choice but to live with her, no matter how much I sobbed or objected. Returning to my parents' house brought back a lot of unpleasant memories, so it felt terrible. I started to eat much less and would frequently throw up, so I suppose the move had a significant psychological and emotional impact on me. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was just 5 years old, and my parents did everything they could to support me. In order for us to all get past our pasts and heal, they even took me to family counseling. My mother stopped drinking and my parents stopped fighting, and I gradually began to feel better as I settled down. I started to trust her because she made an effort to be a more involved parent. Dad wanted to spend more time with us, so much so that he reduced his working hours. But one afternoon, when my dad and I got home from school and discovered my mother was having an affair with him, things took a terrible turn. We happened to walk in on them committing the dirty act because she dared to bring her fair partner into our home. My dad went mute for a few minutes, and I was completely traumatized. His entire face flushed, embarrassing him, while my mother and her pal, who is fair-skinned, scrambled to hide. As he faced my mother and her fair lover, he urged me to go upstairs and they fled the house in terror. I could hear my parents fighting at each other, and my mother, ever the narcissist, accused him of being the reason she had been having an affair, claiming that this other guy made her feel like a regular person and that she was under too much pressure to be flawless. She confided in my father that she felt that because of her prior transgressions, he was constantly let down by her, regardless of what she accomplished. She was a coward, my dad yelled back, and he was done with her. He insisted that she vacate the premises right away. At this point, my mother began pleading with him to stop being so harsh and to stop doing that to his son's mother. He informed him that the other man was meaningless and that they should work on their marriage for my benefit. That evening, my parents were still screaming at each other when my grandma arrived to fetch me up. She did say a few words to my mother, but for the following 2 weeks, she remained largely silent. My parents stayed at home to straighten things out, so I stayed with my grandmother. Every day, my mother would phone and seem as though she was really worried about me. By now, I had come to understand that her only concern was herself. I'm not sure if my dad ultimately chose to stay with my mom under the condition that they begin attending marriage counseling because he truly, truly loves her, or if it was just because he was too accustomed to their chaotic relationship. But even with my father's choice, I was never the same person when it came to my mother. I felt as though I had no more regard for her after discovering her with the other man, as if our family situation could not possibly be worse. After this occurrence, my dad was diagnosed with stomach cancer 3 months later. One day at work, he had terrible cramps in his stomach that left him unconscious. It was later found that he was rapidly losing health and required emergency treatment when he was brought to the hospital. In an attempt to combat the disease, my dad had to take time off work, which resulted in long days of chemotherapeutic bed rest. Even my grandmother was eager to provide a hand, and he had some money saved up. However, this did not sit well with my mother. She would always be whining about how expensive and taxing these medical procedures and therapies were. That gave her hope to at least get a part-time work, and reassured her that once he recovered, he would return to his job and support her as usual. Mom eventually ran out of options and began working as a waiter at a nearby restaurant. My dad's treatment at the hospital required my grandma to take him there and back, so she worked long shifts and would often stay out until late at night. We were greatly assisted by our neighbor, who had a daughter of the same age, offering to drive me to school every day. That's how Shirley and I became friends. We grew up together, so she and I have been friends for a very long time. Since my parents were not very covert about their yelling matches, many neighbors were aware of my family history, including Shirley's parents. Thus, as Shirley and I grew closer, they began extending lunch and dinner invitations to me as well. Neither my dad nor I noticed anything wrong with this, but my mother would always chastise me for staying at their house too much. She would tell me that I was just a broken toy to them and that they just considered me as a charity case. Perhaps this is true in retrospect, but the more time I spent with them, the more I saw how they treated me like one of their own. To be exact, Shirley's mother would always make sure to bake me an apple pie on the weekends after learning that I enjoyed them. I learned to play basketball from Shirley's dad, and we would often practice in front of their garage on evenings. Over time, they kind of grew to be like a second family to me. Therefore, when Shirley and I started dating, nobody was shocked. In the end, Shirley changed my life for the better. And even with my bizarre family background, I am thankful to this day that she is still my girlfriend. Unfortunately, my mother has never truly warmed up to Shirley or her family, but they have always treated me with respect and affection, despite her distaste. After battling illness for a year, my dad's physicians told him that the chemotherapy was no longer working and that his time left was limited. We were all devastated by this news, and I wept for him many nights. I had a hard time processing my grief as a child because I just did not comprehend why I would be losing the only parent who truly loved me. As much as possible, my dad spent his final months with me, my mother, and my grandmother. No matter how much trouble I gave him, one morning he simply stopped waking up, and I knew then that something was amiss. I rushed to inform my mother, who promptly dialed 911. The anguish I felt upon hearing the paramedics say he was dead is beyond words. The fact that he had died quietly while sleeping was the only consolation we could find. I started crying and shouting in anguish, so I wouldn't let them carry my dad's body away until my mom really physically restrained me. I didn't really settle down till my granny got here. I couldn't fathom the sorrow she was experiencing at that very time. There were no problems at all throughout the funeral. The major plot surprise, though, was when Dad's attorney showed up to read his will. That's when I found out that my father had left me his whole estate, including his home. Incredibly, my mother even requested to see the legal documents from the attorney. I suppose my father was aware of her nature and desired for me to inherit his home and any remaining funds from the chemotherapy, enabling me to get a respectable start in life. Mom took offense at this and repeatedly asked the attorney if she could take this to court, arguing that the house should have been hers by default since she was his wife. Nonetheless, my dad's will had been altered well in advance of his chemotherapy, so she had no solid foundation to stand on, and he was in good mental health. When my mother inquired about my plans for the house, I said that I wanted to remain there. She explained to me how we may sell the house and relocate to a better area. But all I had was this house, and I had recently lost my dad. That made me think of him, so I declined. She kept living at the house because, well, it wasn't like she had an option. She did appear really disappointed, but at the time I didn't give it much thought. But my mother told me not even 2 months later that she had met someone and she wanted me to finally meet him. Imagine my amazement, therefore, when I entered the restaurant and she introduced me to none other than Andrew, the same guy my dad and I had discovered her having a sexual relationship with years prior. The man reached out to meet me, and I instantly retreated in horror and disgust. When I questioned my mother whether this was the same guy, she seemed shocked and asked me to take a seat so she could give me more details. I was so angry at my mom for ever believing I would ever want to meet this guy that I refused to even acknowledge him or shake his hand. My mother started to explain that Andrew was only an old friend who helped her feel better after her father passed away, and that they had reconnected after all these years. Her statements gave me the impression that she was lying to me for some reason. I felt even more uneasy because they continued kissing and appeared to be very comfortable with one another. I began to recall all those evenings. When my dad was still alive, she returned home late at night and pretended to be working overtime, even though it would have been perfectly okay for her to meet up with this guy behind our backs. I ignored Andrew every time he tried to strike up a conversation with me that night. Later, I was told how disrespectful it was by my mom, who was furious with me for treating her man so. She even informed me, if I recall correctly, that this was the reason she was considering getting married to Andrew in the upcoming months, so that maybe I would have an encouraging role model in my life. When I heard this, I became furious and told her that I would never want him in my life. If they were to get married, she would have to move out of my house, because I would much rather live alone than with a man who would have dared to have an affair with her when my father was still living. I had no real choice in this matter because my mom threatened to sue me, saying that I was still underage and that she was my parents. Regretfully, she was accurate and faithful to her promise. Andrew and she were shortly married, and he moved into our home right away. He made it a point to tell me he was the man of the home every day after he moved in. I had images of me and my dad in our living room, and he detested it. I thus learned that he had removed those photos and stored them in the basement the day I returned from school. He informed me that he and my mother needed to start over when I aggressively confronted him. I could therefore only hang photos of my dad in my bedroom, as if I didn't already detest him for this. He was also very domineering. Every time my mother's shift finished, he would give her a call, and he would give her another call if she was even a minute late getting home. He began to do this slowly with me as well, but I quickly stopped him. I told him I was going to stay out as long as I pleased, and that he was in no way my father. It wasn't like he could lock me out. I had the house keys anyway. Don't get me wrong though, I wasn't going out to parties or anything like that. All I had to do was spend my evenings studying and doing my schoolwork in peace at Shelley's house or the library. I also maintained a positive relationship with my grandmother during this time and made every effort to see her. We would just sit and talk about the good old days or watch an old black and white movie. Even though I didn't have big expectations for her, my mom didn't even make an effort to attend my high school graduation. I was still a little bummed that my parents were the only ones that didn't give a damn about me by this point, but Shirley's parents and my grandma supported me and applauded me at graduation. Subsequently, as I was preparing to head out to a party with my friends, my mother entered my room to tell me that she and Andrew believed that I had grown up and should now take charge of the household. Bewildered, I asked her what she meant because I do my own laundry and dishwashing every time. At this point, my mother told me that I needed to quit paying the household costs and get a job. According to her, Andrew thought I wasn't doing enough and that, as an adult, he should have expected me to make financial contributions. Though I was a little annoyed that she didn't give me a day to celebrate before breaking the news to me, I nevertheless decided to pitch in as much as I could. I applied to several universities at the same time that I applied for a job as a Burger King cashier, which I was hired for within the next 2 weeks. I eventually was accepted into a reputable college in my hometown, so I was able to avoid wasting money by staying in dorms, but I still needed to have a car so that I could get to courses more easily. I made the decision to speak with my mother to beg for her assistance in purchasing a car, but she and Andrew became enraged right away. Upon hearing this, Andrew angrily told me that, considering their meager incomes, they were providing for me more than enough, and that, once and for all, I ought to quit being so self-centered. Mother didn't even try to defend me, even though I couldn't quite understand what he meant when he said that I was selfish in his book. She informed me that I had to work things out for myself because I was an adult. Just a few weeks later, to my amazement, I got up to find that some workers had begun rebuilding the downstairs bathroom and kitchen. I questioned my mother about it, and she said that Andrew was planning to make some small changes around the house because he was tired of the way it looked old and rusty. They said they didn't even have enough money to help me out with the car, so I inquired where they obtained the money to accomplish this. When my mother heard this a few weeks earlier, she became irate with me and told me that I was being unreasonable to expect their assistance over the upcoming few weeks. I watched while Mom and Andrew remodeled the entire house and made various changes. I just kept my head down and kept my mouth shut the entire time. Shirley made every effort to lift my spirits, understanding that I was upset about this. But when I got home today, I saw my clothes and belongings in the living room. I hurried to see whether my belongings were there and screamed at my mother to tell her to put them in my room. At this point, Andrew's mother came downstairs to inform me that they needed to have a serious conversation with me. They continued with great excitement, revealing that they had been keeping this information to themselves for more than 2 months and that Mom was expecting Andrew's child. Andrew continued by saying that he had a duty to put his child's needs first as the child's father. He had so made the decision to turn my room into his baby's nursery. He continued, and I gaped in disbelief, saying that he and my mother had decided they could no longer support a freeloader. Therefore, it was time for me to move out and live on my own. Mom agreed, nodding, and said I could move in with Grandma until I could afford a place of my own. Tears were starting to form in my eyes. I felt so unwelcome at that point that I didn't even try to argue with them. To spend the night at my grandma's house, I took all of my critical paperwork and called an Uber. She despises my mother much more now that she is as astute as I am. I wanted to get some legal advice first, but she wanted to go straight back and confront my parents. I recently turned 18, and I feel I should be the rightful owner of the house. Will it be difficult for me to get my mother and Andrew off the property? Will I need to speak with a lawyer about this? First update. All right, guys, I appreciate all of your advice. After reading every comment, I made the decision to follow the advice of the majority of you. I first went to see my lawyer today to better grasp my legal position. The attorney advised me that since my dad's well was clearly visible, Mom and Andrew had no legal claim to the house, and that I should give them a formal eviction notice so that I could later sue them for violating it. I went to my house with my grandmother after this. I didn't even bother to ring the doorbell because I had the keys to my apartment. Fortunately, nobody was home. Thankfully, Shirley's father agreed to assist me change the locks on the back door and the main entrance when I called him. The locks had been changed by the time Shirley and Andrew got home. My grandmother and I met them on the porch outside, and I wouldn't let them inside. Although my 5'5" grandma was not in the slightest bit afraid of Andrew, he was outraged to see me standing there. With a direct look in his eyes, she gave him a 30-day notice to vacate. They couldn't stop me from selling the house since I had made the decision to do so. I then gave them a written notice that was signed by my attorney and detailed their 30-day notice of eviction as well as the legal repercussions for not complying. Angry, Andrew took the paper out of my hand and examined his face. Grandma cautioned him that destroying it wouldn't make a difference, so he crumpled it instead. It was not negotiable that they would have 30 days. Mom began to plead with me, telling me that I shouldn't have caused her so much worry throughout her pregnancy as she saw this happen. She continued by expressing how inconvenient it would be for them to move out at a time when she was already dealing with a lot. I started screaming at her for being such a terrible mother to me for all these years because I was so angry at her for never standing up for me. I reminded her that when she would be drunk and pass out, she would just leave me on my own. I advised her to stop living at my house and get a home of her own as an adult. She began pleading even harder after hearing this, but I told her that she and her squandering spouse were done living off of me and my home. Andrew tried to ignore me and enter the house, looking scared, but soon learned that the locks had been changed and his keys were no longer functional. He continued to yell at me, but I told him that since he was in fact trespassing on my land, I would report him to the police. Right now, it was wonderful to watch him appear angry and helpless. I warned them both that this was just the beginning for their new kid and all of their problems. I warned them that if they didn't listen to me, I would not only sue them, but also make sure that everything would go out of their bank account so that I could finally sell the house and get the money back. I assured them that I had nothing to lose and that my grandmother and I would be staying with them for the next 30 days to make sure they were packed and moving out. I was not having it when Andrew and Mom tried to argue back, evidently not expecting this. I told them they could go to a motel if they didn't like what I was saying, and that I would carry all of their belongings out to the porch for them to pick up. After all, I was the owner, and they were only guests. Their expressions changed to a mixture of desperation and wrath the following morning, but they realized that I was finished with their nonsense. It was time for them to respect that this was my house, and these were my rules. Second update. Whoa. When I awoke this morning, my TikTok post was there. Since I live in a small town, there's a good potential that my friends or neighbors will recognize me if they see the video I posted, or the post that's been making the rounds. To answer your questions, I'm providing my mom and Andrew a 30-day legal notice because according to my lawyer, doing so will make sure they have no legal basis to suit me in the event that we ever go to court. I want to be fair to those who are inquiring about the amount of money my stepdad spent on the house renovation. I'm willing to pay him back for the remodeling expenses when I sell the house, as long as he can give accurate invoices that my attorney can validate. For those who are wondering, the reason my mom, grandma, and I are remaining here with Andrew is that I don't want them to be able to unjustly claim any portion of this land since they don't pay me rent. I am the home's owner, and I will not be leaving my land. They cannot even say that they leave here without a key because I have refused to give them a key to my doors. My non-nonsense grandmother wants to be present to make sure these leeches leave the area as quickly as possible. Update 3. I haven't sent him an update in a while. As some of you may have anticipated, my stepdad and mother tried to do pranks and wouldn't give up as soon as their 30-day legal notice was up. But because I'm more intelligent than they are, I moved everything they needed on the porch and wouldn't let them back in the next time they came for my mom's ultrasound. When they returned, they attempted to phone the police to report me, but the cops were powerless to assist. I explained that my stepdad and mother didn't even have a key to the house, and I collectedly presented them documentation proving I was the rightful owner. When the police saw this, they told them that if they wanted to dispute my allegation, they had to go to court. Andrew proceeded to approach me angrily and called out to me, but one of the cops gave him a warning to stop or else he would be taken into custody. My mom and Andrew were eventually evicted from my property, and it was pleasant to see them come to terms with what they had lost. I've since had cameras placed throughout my property and spoken with a real estate agent who will begin showing the house to prospective purchasers the following week.